So I'm delighted to be here with you all and to have had such a wonderful day of very, very rich and wonderful presentations. I'm very sorry that Professor Evelyn Hammonds can't be with us, as Anne explained, but I'm very happy to welcome our two panelists. First, Marie Griffiths, who's Professor in the Department of Religion at Princeton University. Her many publications include a co-edited book called Women and Religion in the African Diaspora, Knowledge, Power and Performance, which came out in 2006, and two earlier books, Born Again Bodies, Flesh and Spirit in American Christianity, and God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission. And I mention these in particular because she will be reflecting today on the different ways in which gender has mattered, gender analysis, to these three particular projects. Our second panelist is Lara Deeb, who is Assistant Professor of Women's Studies at the University of California at Irvine. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International and Area Studies at Harvard University. And she's the author of many articles on, among other things, Islamic feminisms and on the transformation of the Shia religious ritual, and the author of a book, The Enchanted Modern, which portrays the construction of an alternative modernity by Shia Muslims who consider themselves simultaneously deeply modern, cosmopolitan, and pious. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Layla, and I just want to thank Anne again, as we all have, for sponsoring this event. The events here are always terrific that Anne puts together, and I appreciate being asked to speak today. As Layla mentioned, Anne suggested that I speak about the distinctive ways in which gender analysis has mattered for my work over time, using as concrete examples three major research projects that have occupied my attention over the past 10 to 15 years, really since I was a doctoral student in the Committee on the Study of Religion here at Harvard, which was a while ago now. So just to lay these out front, I think it's really, I'm going to really talk about the three projects Layla has mentioned. The first was the doctoral dissertation that became my first book, God's Daughters. And the second, I'll talk about the book that I completed while a research fellow in the Women's Studies in Religion program here at Harvard Divinity School in 2002-2003, Born Again Bodies. And the third is the essay collection that I recently co-edited with Barbara Diane Savage of the University of Pennsylvania, Women and Religion in the African Diaspora. And I'll just say I'm currently working on a book about sexuality and the history of evangelicalism in transatlantic context, but that work is rather so new that Anne kindly let me off the hook that I didn't really have to yet say I'm still sort of in that inarticulate stage about gender theory there. But I do want to just disavow at the outset any simplistic notions of progressive evolution that this trajectory may evoke. Surely, in some ways, like many of us, I do better appreciate gender's role in my research today than I did a decade ago. But on the other hand, we are all prone to forgetting important knowledge that we once had. And moreover, it certainly seems the case that different sorts of projects demand different ways of thinking about religion and gender. So although I'm sticking to something of a chronological narrative, it's a story of shiftings and of partial truths, as some say, rather than one of linear progress and enlightenment. So I'm talking about gender theory and American religious history today, and I invoke this term theory in the title somewhat hesitantly, as I don't think anyone would mistake me as someone whose work has currency in respectable circles of feminist theorizing. I mean, somehow it doesn't sound quite right to say, as Judith Butler and Marie Griffith argue. I mean, this doesn't sound right, does it? No. It makes rather more sense for me to retreat into my identity as a historian of American religion, where I'm far more comfortable. But this very hesitation about theory may be relevant here as a sign of what I think could be the narrowing of the concept of theory in our time. From one angle, theory has come to suggest a body of analytic work that is, paradoxically enough, far more expansive in disciplinary scope, and yet, at the same time, more limited in terms of subject matter, keywords, and acknowledged authorities than I remember imagining it when I was a doctoral student in religion. And just to give one example here, a program unit that I co-chair at the AAR, the Religion and Sexuality Consultation, identifies itself in informational materials now as being focused on empirical work, as a way of distinguishing it from those other program units on sexuality that focus on theory. Now, this seems like a false distinction in my view, and it's one that I thought we'd overcome a good long time ago. But I was strongly encouraged to describe my group this way by a prominent scholar on the steering committee for the queer theory group, who seemed invested in the separate status of empirical work, or who thought that others would sort of get this distinction in important ways. So this throws into question, at least for me, what theory now means in relation to empirical methods of historical and ethnographic research. And Theda Skocpol mentioned, she kind of mentioned my work is empirical here. What does this mean? It's an old debate, to be sure, theory and empirical work. But it's worth considering again in our present moment, and certainly in American religious history. And I just want to mention that a graduate student in my graduate seminar, a graduate student from sociology, was mentioning the other day that in sociological circles, theory is sort of relegated to qualitative research, which of course in these hierarchies as they come, the quantitative people might see qualitative research as being somehow less scientific, less important, and that's where theory goes there. So I think these are debates going on. We know this in a variety of disciplines. Now, for some of us, being trained in the early 1990s as historians of American religion with interest in gender, a theory about historical patterns of gender was wondrously evident in the thickly empirical work of historians in other fields. And I could name many names, but I would name notably Natalie Zeman Davis and Caroline Walker Bynum, both of whose work really sparked my interest as a college student in historical scholarship on gender, religion, and culture more broadly. This was just exciting stuff. And there was theory in this historical research. It was very, very clear. It was all blended there together. Another inspiration for me would have been Joan Wallach Scott, who has never for 1 minute reified any false distinction between gender theory and historical analysis. Robert Orsi, whose subtle analytic work generated such excitement in several generations of graduate students, including my own. And, of course, feminist historians of American women's religious history, such as Carol Carlson and, of course, Anne Braude, who I should say publicly here was my first teacher of American women's religious history. Not that she's that much older than I am, so I know that's a double-edged sword to mention that, but just that here at Harvard, when you came for that year, that was my first class ever, and it was just rich, exciting stuff. We, as students, found important models for gender analysis in the work of monumental figures such as Mary Douglas, surely no self-styled feminist. And this is to say, I suppose, that we found it where we could. We absorbed rich and provocative theoretical analyses about purity and pollution, dirt and taboo, of social anxiety and distinction. And we applied these theories as they seemed useful to a broader understanding of women and gender. These were also the days, the early 1990s, when the rubric of lived religion was being hammered out at Harvard and elsewhere by David Hall, among others. And so we were deeply interested in theoretical models such as Michel de Certeau in The Practice of Everyday Life, his book that really took for granted many of Foucault's insights about power and yet averted despair, as we saw it, by exploring small acts of ordinary and extraordinary resistance. And James Scott's Weapons of the Weak would be another model, and again, there would be many more. So part of my own interest in pursuing the 2-year ethnographic project that became my dissertation and later the book God's Daughters, which was published in 1997, stemmed from a realization that feminist models of gender at that time did not adequately account for those women, like the evangelical and neo-Pentecostal women I was meeting and studying, who passionately embraced the rhetoric of traditional femininity and the practice of female submission to male authority. During my coursework, and I did some coursework here in feminist theology, and even in my coursework in American women's religious history, the theoretical models to which I was exposed celebrated women's liberation from tradition. So feminist scholarship was still, in this sense, tied very directly to feminist politics. And there was little interest at that time in women who were on a different path. Though I just have to say that, Anne, I remember that we read Maribel Morgan's Total Woman in your class. So maybe this was a sign, of greater multiplicity that this was changing. But I also think Anne was probably more open to this, challenging the liberationist model than others at the time. A sort of false consciousness model of religiously conservative women still held sway. And this seemed to me and to some of my cohort as immobilizing, and I mean immobilizing in a methodological as well as a political sense, as Foucault's analytic appropriation of the panopticon. I wanted out. And moreover, I wanted my women to benefit from a richer analysis of their complicated gendered lives. So I suppose it's no surprise in retrospect that the questions that really consumed me in God's Daughters had to do with agency and power. How could we see these women as complicated actors and authors, not simply negotiating their own oppression, as if religion were merely compensatory for miserable social circumstances, but carefully crafting fluid identities and thoughtful lives? How could feminist observers interpret such women without succumbing to the easy contempt that Andrea Dworkin had heaped on them in her popular book, Right-Wing Women? Was it possible to write about conservative religious women without being tarred with guilt by association, or kept out of what was then a rather clubby world of feminist scholarship and religion? These questions were all deeply linked in my mind with ways of theorizing gender and of theorizing scholarship on religion and gender. And I absorbed helpful theoretical insights from a number of scholars beyond those already mentioned, including Gail Biederman, Sarah Coakley, who came to Harvard during my graduate years, Jean Bethke Elshtain, Faye Ginsberg, Sherry Ortner, and others. And I mention these to show that these are theologians, historians, anthropologists, sociologists. I mean, it was really quite an interdisciplinary mix. As I worked my way through these questions about female agency and gendered power, they gradually faded in urgency for me, giving way to what I suppose was the next major set of gender questions in my career. And these had more to do with embodiment, and particularly with ways of performing femininity and masculinity than with agency and power per se. Now, questions about embodiment and performance have long been important in religious studies, though were arguably somewhat newer in feminist theory, though certainly not brand new. One sees deep concerns about embodiment and gender performance in the early feminist writers such as Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, along with many others. But still, less work has brought together analysis of religion and gender performance, and that is ways in which particular enactments of religious disciplines, a term that Janet brought out in her presentation this morning, ways in which religious disciplines have reinforced femininity and masculinity. In Born Again Bodies, then, and so that's 2004, so that's 7 years past God's Daughters, I tried to analyze visual and textual representations of gendered religious bodies. The manly bodybuilders and extreme fasters of the progressive era, the well-fed black body of Father Divine, in contrast with the lean, authoritative black masculinity that was later promoted by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, before and after photographs of obese evangelical dieters who were desperate to get thin in order to please God, and as well as the godly authorities in their lives. The meanings and imagery surrounding Christian diet book titles by women, such as Slim for Him, Fit for God, and More of Jesus, Less of Me. How does religious practice gender Christian bodies? And what are the effects of this complicated process of gendering upon the wider culture in which these bodies live and which they themselves help create? In pursuing this line of thought, I was helped by some of my old favorite inspirations, such as Bynum, Coakley, and Joan Scott, as well as newer ones, including Judith Butler's work on the body and gender performativity, and the work of theoretically minded historians like Amy Hollywood, Sandra Gilman, and Thomas LaCour. If God's Daughters focus chiefly on questions about women and agency, that is, women's negotiations within and against the structures and scripts that bound their lives, the second book, Born Again Bodies, aimed rather less cautiously, and in the end more somberly, at scrutinizing the multiplicity of gendered practices and modes of embodiment that served as such constraining structures. So agency plays virtually no role in that book. Now, why, to exaggerate somewhat simplistically, did more or less coercive models of gender formation prevail in this second project over Michel de Certeau's more hopeful model of improvisation, negotiation, and resistance? Is it because I came to disavow an earlier stance of critical empathy with empathic engagement with religious actors, such as conservative religious women? Is it because I belatedly understood that evangelicals really do suffer from false consciousness more than non-evangelicals do? Of course not. The shift had far more to do with the divergent goals of these research projects. So that whereas the one asked, how do these particular evangelical women understand themselves in relation to feminism and in relation to the religious authorities to which they have chosen to submit, however complicated that choice turns out to be? And the second project asked, how are Protestant women and men shaped by culture and modernity in ways that they imagine to embody freedom, but that in the end plainly reinstill the dread and anxiety of relentless discipline? Now, I still consider both questions worth asking in a variety of historical and contemporary contexts and worth asking together. And I would continue to argue that each finds common cause with different bodies of theory, while also stretching the limits that some of these theories may have bequeathed to us. Perhaps the iron cage of anxious fitness disciplines drained me. I think it did. But in any case, agency surged to the fore again in the collection I co-edited with Barbara Savage, Women in Religion in the African Diaspora, that just came out with Johns Hopkins University Press. And just listen to the subtitle words here: knowledge, power, and performance. In 13 specially commissioned essays, this collection illuminates some ways in which diverse women of African descent have practiced religion as part of the work of their ordinary lives. While a good deal of work on lived religion has focused on women and on gendered negotiations of power, very little has concerned itself specifically with black women. Indeed, there's been a dearth of scholarly attention to black religious women nationally and transnationally, as Carol also shows us, among historians more generally. Centering women of African descent in this analytic space that's opened up by lived religion allows us to ask important questions. For instance, what happens to our ideas about religion when black women surface as central protagonists in American, Caribbean, or post-colonial African settings or Canadian settings? How does attention to gendered forms of religious experience shift our understandings of diaspora, a fascinating and very complicated concept that is still evolving through varied imaginings and reinventions? And when we focus on the complexities of African diasporic crossings in particular, what new things do we learn by studying women's resourceful uses of religious ideas and idioms and practices? Now, because these questions remained not simply unanswered or under-theorized, but in fact unasked, Barbara and I felt there was still much to be gained from studying women within a diasporic context and subjecting them to a variety of analyses, not only gender analysis. And we believed this even if it meant opening ourselves up to the critique of having reverted to an old-fashioned recovery model of women's history. And this is a model that many have disparaged as well past its prime, and I would have to admit I've done that myself. There's not a lot of direct engagement with gender theory in this collection. But the historiographical context, I think, makes a crucial difference here. Many important traditional studies of African and African-derived traditions, including African American religious studies, have continued to privilege men in priestly leadership functions, rendering invisible, or at least less important, the majority of religious workers or practitioners who are women. So in our project, and this is certainly true of Carol Duncan's project as well, women are the center of inquiry. And that recentering has brought its own revelations about the extensive cultural and political work of black women in transnational settings. So I think what I've learned over time is recovery history still has its important uses. So let me conclude here then. I've set out the ways in which gender has mattered and mattered differently in 3 projects I've undertaken so far in my career. These different projects have suggested distinct ways of analyzing the intersection of religion and gender. And so I have turned to disparate bodies of historical and theoretical analysis. There's still room in this field, I think, for deeper consideration of agency, of gendered negotiation of social roles, including something that we may still profit from calling resistance, and of anti-feminist women who practice such strategies. And we need these analyses if we're to expand and improve upon what I think remains an impoverished vocabulary about women and power. And all of you who have taught classes on women and religion know this to be true. I mean, the language about empowerment, oppression, fall flat in the classroom, as they should probably. So this vocabulary remains impoverished. I certainly hope also that studies of the body and sexuality remain viable in the field, not merely as presentist questions that we impose on the past, but as fresh modes of theoretical inquiry that newly illumine the past for us. And finally, there is also both room and need for recovery models, particularly when we're thinking about those women who still, after all these years of women's history, remain invisible in the historical record. As another graduate student said to me the other day, theory is that which reminds us of what needs to be analyzed, those aspects that we may not otherwise perceive. So particular gender theories have their special uses in different contexts, though none provide a rigid blueprint for how to proceed in all future work. I'll stop there. Thank you.
And we're going to have questions now.
You want to? Yes. Well, I think, right. Yeah, it's a good clarification. I think recovery meaning a kind of model for saying these women have been ignored. They don't exist in the historical record. And so the very fact of looking at them at all makes our projects worthy, period, because we need to know something we didn't know before. I think that the work I did previously, I would have seen anyway, more as revisionist work. You know, we have a lot out there on evangelical women that's really bad, and so how can we create better analyses, but of something that some other scholars have told us something about. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make. Does that make more sense? Yeah, Carol. Oh, I'm sorry. You should do this. Go ahead.
I'm Carol. Thank you so much for your really great paper. I'm using your latest book, actually, the collection in my course, and it's really fantastic. I wanted to ask you a question about agency and resistance, and I have some reluctance also sometimes with the category of resistance. Let me be very brief in saying that sometimes I feel that it's as if the author is asking the subjects to kind of do some work of resistance for the author and for themselves. And I say this with, all sort of good humor and intention for everybody here, myself included. That's kind of my reservation sometimes. If the historical subject is being placed in categories or the use of literature or theories that really are anachronisms almost in some case. They don't really have anything to do with the situation. They're being put through it for some other purposes. So that's kind of my reluctance with it. I'm wondering what yours is.
Yeah.
And, your kind of resurrecting it here.
Yeah, well, I think you've stated it beautifully. I mean, I think this is true. This was, one of the concerns, again, that I think many of us, I don't just say myself, that we were talking about in graduate school, that why is good religion liberationist religion? And are we reading too much liberation into these, models, historical or contemporary? And I think you're right, and sort of seeing resistance where it doesn't really exist, where we want to see it, or we see the tiniest acts there. So that is my hesitation about it. But it's a really fine balance, because I think the other extreme is not helpful either, to sort of only see women or any group that you're thinking about as being pawns of a system that is beyond their control, and not valuing what they see as a livable life, and of action in the world. So I agree. I think it's dangerous, and it's one reason that this term resistance has somewhat, at least in things I read, sort of dropped out. I think the limits of it are evident. But I think some of the stuff that I read goes so far in the other direction that it seems rather full of despair to me. So I suppose it's really always kind of trying to find that balance. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, but I appreciate your articulation of that, because I think that is the difficulty there.
Any questions on the other deck?
Okay, I'll let you do this later. Yeah.
I was wondering, actually, comment only very quickly, maybe you can expand a little bit on it, the terminology of oppression and similar terminology called splat in the classroom. I experienced the same thing, but I wonder if it has to do with the terminology, or if it doesn't have something to do with the kind of socio-political context in which we teach and live.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you want to comment a little bit more on that.
So does it have to do with the terminology itself that's impoverished, or the fact that students coming in are reluctant to call themselves feminist, or reluctant to identify with that tradition in part? Or
it doesn't have to.
Yeah.
We're living in a conservative socio-political moment, and doesn't that more tell us something about our time rather than terminology?
Absolutely. No, I completely agree, and I'm not trying to say these words weren't helpful and useful terms and might still have value, but I guess I'm sympathetic to the students for the same reason that Carol's articulated the problems with resistance, that if I think these terms have become so weighted that I understand the students' reluctance in a sense, but opening them up or trying to talk about, I guess it's one of the things I try to bring out in the classroom. What do these terms mean? What is their history? And if you don't like these terms, what's a better term? How else might we analyze this? So I agree. I think there's a place for the terminology and that it is in part a factor of our time. And that students often, what they'll wind up saying, they wind up using these terms towards the end of a class in spite of themselves or recognizing some of that. So I don't know, that's a vague answer, but I think you're right that it's contextual in that sense.
Perhaps we should have the next speaker and then open it up for general discussion. Okay, thank you.
Once again, I want to add my voice of thanks to those thanking Anne for organizing this event. I come out of an anthropology program, and I'm now in a gender studies, women's studies program. So this is my first religious studies sort of interdisciplinary forum. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to be able to participate in a different kind of interdisciplinarity. So what I'm going to do in my time this afternoon is talk a bit about some of the questions that I have been thinking about in my work, specifically in looking at the relationship between women's piety and politics and between religious faith and political activism, especially in the current political moment in which we're living, where Islam has become a trope that's thrown around in very detrimental ways, often, though not always, in relation to gender. And in the process, I'll talk a bit about a piece I'm in the initial stages of writing right now and how I'm thinking about approaching it with a focus on the ways that transnational discourses about Muslim women's status are engaged and deployed in various ways. And I think I'll also be bringing back some of the themes that have already come up, especially around representation and politics. My first project, and one that is in some ways ongoing in different forms, is based on ethnographic research in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is a series of neighborhoods with a mostly Shia Muslim population and is the area that here in the press is talked about as the Hezbollah stronghold. And that label has the effect of both sort of immediately magnifying the political dimensions of my work, but I also want to insist that the explicitness of the political in this particular case doesn't mean that the questions of politics that it raises are not relevant to other contexts. And I also just want to note that while Hezbollah is the most popular political party in this area, in no way is the pious Shi'i community in this area coterminous with the political party. So for the past few years, I've been writing about the ways that particular expressions and cultivations of piety have emerged in this community in conjunction with particular definitions and expressions of modernity. And I always use modern as a value-laden and context-derived concept, which in this specific context distills down to notions of progress in both the spiritual and the material senses. This codependence of ideas about being pious and ideas about being modern on one another has emerged in a particularly gendered way. So it is women who are primarily responsible for demonstrating and inhabiting a moral position related to both states, piety and modernity, in the contemporary world. And women have also come to be viewed as a barometer of sorts of the community's status itself. Now, there are obviously political stakes in writing about this, as well as a set of difficulties that come more generally with writing about Islam and gender today in the United States. I'm very struck, for example, by the very different reception that my work has received pre- and post-2001. And I don't mean at all to reify September 11 as an absolute moment of rupture. I don't think that makes much sense, as many of the discourses around gender in Islam have been around for much longer. We see it, for example, in colonial Egypt, as in Layla's work, and Afsaneh just noted another sort of phase of this discourse post-1979. But I have noticed a higher level of almost skeptical response in relation to my work, ranging from people who seem simply unwilling to believe that piety can be a desire that trumps what is imagined as a more desirable state of freedom, to others who hear my description of the ways that women draw upon ideal values embodied by role models from Islamic history and assume that that then reflects a desire to return to the time of the Prophet in all of that its detail. And the latter assumption also includes another layer of assumptions about religious time necessarily being circular. That's a whole other aspect of it. And I've also seen similar patterns in scholarship where just recently, for example, I heard a lecture in which a scholar presented an argument that once again focused almost entirely on a purely instrumentalist reading of the headscarf, of the hijab. And it was a reading that was devoid of any consideration of faith or religious practice or ideas about morality or ideas about social relationships, and instead suggested that women in this particular community, which happened to be in Eastern Europe, had no other choice in the face of what what she called a new Islamic patriarchy, that they had to wear the hijab in order to be able to continue to go about their lives. Now, having said this, it turned out that, in fact, a minority of women in this particular community had actually begun wearing the hijab, and that buried in the lecture itself, there were a plethora of more complex dynamics at work around ideas about morality and the post-communist economy. So my point here is simply that this sort of reductive ahistorical analysis is still with us, and is rooted in part, I think, in an unwillingness to view practices of piety as a form of agency to a certain extent. But then on the other hand, in reacting to such instrumentalist arguments, it's also possible to slip into another sort of reductive argument where piety becomes a singular aspect of life unto itself, fully detached from other daily practices, from politics, from complex social environments, and from relationships. And I don't think that's a sufficient approach either. So I've been trying to find a language through which to discuss the complexities of the relationship between piety and politics in relation to conceptualizations of economics, modernity, time, and gender, and trying to do so while refusing to allow that relationship between piety and politics to reduce to a causal equation in either direction. Now, another element in this is the need to negotiate two sets of limiting ideas, which Marie just brought up to a certain extent as well. On the one hand, these can stem from a particular feminist discourse that has insisted on narrow definitions of emancipation, in which there's no room for certain practices of piety or ideas about pious selves. And on the other hand, there are limitations that stem from an understanding of religiosity that sometimes insists on its delineation in a separate sphere. Whereas in the community that I'm talking about, the idea of a moral worldview is a much better description of the ways that my interlocutors think about their relationship to Islam than the term religion as a separate category is. So as an example, in the southern suburbs, one form that emerged piety politics, and here neither term is meant to modify the other, one form it has taken is women's increased participation in the public arena, often, though not exclusively at all, through Islamic social welfare organizations. In analyzing this, I've looked at a number of elements, including how it's related to the institutionalization of specifically Shia Muslim networks and organizations in Lebanon since the 1970s, which has to do with details of Lebanese history and a particular Shia Islamic movement that emerged there in the late 60s. I've also looked at how this is related to the concurrent development of a new model of ideal moral womanhood for pious Lebanese Shia women, which is a model that emphasizes particular forms of publicly expressed piety as a key aspect of being considered a modern person. So public participation becomes a key part of that ideal model of womanhood in terms of contribution to the common good of the community, in terms of the cultivation of one's own piety, and in terms of demonstrating the modern status of oneself and one's community to the outside world. And it's this last piece I want to pick up more today, which also has to do with women's direct contestation through their actions of transnational stereotypes about pious Muslim women as passive or as oppressed. So one of the methodological frameworks that I have found useful for understanding the complexity of the relationship between religion and politics in this context is to look at these issues through a transnational feminist lens. And what I want to highlight when I refer to transnational analysis is not necessarily about sort of multi-sided field research, but rather about attending to our interlocutors' engagements with discourses that emerge in transnational contexts of power, including capitalism and militarism. And obviously, in the current political moment, I'm talking about U.S. neo-imperialism, for lack of a better word. I'll just use the term neo-imperialism, and its effects specifically in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. So one of the venues in which public participation was discussed, and through which it was encouraged and facilitated in Lebanon, was a series of seminars on the importance of women's public role that were sponsored by the Women's Committee and the Women's Politburo of Hezbollah. In these seminars, women would tackle different topics, including things like running women on the party's parliamentary election slates, various educational issues, how to encourage men to participate more in the domestic arena, the specificities of patriarchy in Lebanon, the role of bad Islamic interpretation in making women's public participation more difficult, a whole gamut of issues such as these. Throughout these various discussions, participants often drew on transnational examples and discourses to make their points. So, for example, the classic example of women's participation in the Algerian anti-colonial resistance came up frequently as a cautionary point, an example from which women were to learn a lesson, so as to prevent such a reaction against women's public role in the event of peace with Israel. Iran was also raised as another example in this vein where the situation was consistently described as better than what happened in Algeria, but not good enough. And so women would point to certain aspects of certain laws that had been passed in Iran as improvements or as points to which they would refer when arguing for things within the Lebanese polity, but then also be critical of other aspects. The mixed blessing sort of response to Iran is particularly interesting in light of assumptions that Hezbollah merely mirrors Iranian policies or goals and points both to the limitations of that relationship and also to the diversity of views that exist within the party and this community itself. Transnational discourses about gender norms also emerged in very ambivalent ideas about Western women. On the one hand, in describing their ideal model, women would regularly draw upon examples from Islamic history, emphasizing the active economic, intellectual, and leadership roles that women like Sayyidah Zainab or Sayyidah Khadija played in their society, and the qualities of outspokenness, resilience, or resourcefulness they demonstrated. Yet they also drew upon their ideas about Western women, which were not limited to points of contrast. In fact, many of my interlocutors idealized North America and Europe as places where women were supposedly able to carry out their public roles without facing any opposition from their families or society. Most striking among these engagements with transnational discourses and norms were conscious responses to ideas about the West's views of Muslim women. Participants in these seminars, as well as many other women in the southern suburbs of Beirut, often commented on the interest that journalists took in, quote, Hezbollah women. Many of the seminar participants had been interviewed by reporters, and they observed that these reporters were, as one woman put it, all looking to see if Islam is modern, and what the women do is the marker of what is modern. Others commented that this was also because Westerners all think that Muslim women are backward and oppressed, and they took on as one of their tasks challenging those perspectives both to demonstrate their own modernity and that of their society. And this was a very common topic of conversation. Over and over again, people would discuss and express a really acute understanding of the political importance of perceptions of women's status to perceptions of the level of modernity of a place or people, or the idea that, as another person put it, a culture is judged by the level of its women. And combating stereotypes about Muslim women was viewed as part of one's duty as a moral person in the community, and in a way as an aspect of religious and social duty. So these engagements with transnational discourses about Muslim women provide a contemporary example of the ways that gender norms are understood to be important to the boundaries between binary civilizational constructs. So that in this constructed opposition between Islam and the West, women's activities, status, visibility, and bodies mark the border between us and them on both sides. Historically, again, this is a common theme. We see it in literature on colonialism and in anti-colonial nationalist movements. We also saw this in the figure of the West-toxicated woman whose materialism and immorality provided a point of idealized contrast for both Islamist and leftist women during the 1978-79 Iranian Revolution. And a more recent example is the figure of the oppressed Muslim women in need of liberation by the U.S. military that emerged most strikingly in the case of the rhetoric around Afghanistan, where the burqa was used to provide moral justification for the attack. Now, in the U.S.'s complicity with this summer's Israeli attack on Lebanon, Muslim women were not mentioned. However, this discourse in which women play perhaps the key representative role in defining civilizational status remains a major subtext within which dynamics of U.S. power are negotiated in Lebanon and other conflicts like that in Iraq. This type of gender construction legitimates military adventure even when it's not explicit. It does so by bifurcating the world into those who are deemed civilized and those who are not, and by erasing the political and the economic in favor of essentializing explanations that make claims about naturalized identities, which these days are often rooted in ideas about naturalized religious difference. And also by constructing armed opposition to military attack as terrorists hiding behind helpless women and children, which once again sets up certain women as in need of saving from their men, this time again along religious lines. So the stakes of the politics of representation in this case are material and military. It's in this context that Shi'i women's public participation has become central to their signifying the modernity of their community within a transnational field. So ideas about gender and religion are critical here because of local concern, international concern, and local concern about this international concern. Pious Shi'i women's engagements with and articulations of transnational discourses about gender are not only reactive to this context, however. While on the one hand, they were focused on opposing their own models of ideal womanhood to stereotypes about Muslim women, as well as to stereotyped others, so the stereotyped Western woman, this was also a productive engagement through which various elements were transformed into a new model of ideal pious womanhood that was different from what had existed 20 years ago, say, in Lebanon. In this sense, my interlocutors themselves moved beyond the binaries of civilizational thinking, or began to do so. And what I'm starting to work on right now includes an attempt to take a closer analytic look at the parallels and the divergences of these current engagements with transnational discourses about gender, with similar engagements in different historical periods, and especially in anti-colonial movements. So in part, this is going to involve thinking through the uses and limits of the insights of post-colonial scholarship, for example, for contemporary U.S. neo-imperialism. So, for example, if you're thinking about Partha Chatterjee's analysis of anti-colonial nationalists in India, this analysis is one in which Bengali women were delegated the maintenance of the spiritual domain, and material development and modernization was conceptualized as the domain of nationalist men. Women's spiritual responsibility was linked to a gendered division of space into public and domestic spheres, and then even with 19th century shifts in gender norms that facilitated elite women's emergence into public spaces, the gendered nature of this material spiritual divide remained, with a continued association of the public with the masculine. Now, in contrast, in the Shi'i Lebanese case today, the material and spiritual domains are linked without a similarly prominent gender divide. And where such a divide can be discerned, it's in fact women who are allotted the greater responsibility of representing modernity in all its dimensions, including the material, and sometimes especially the material. So I'm starting to think about how to address these differences, especially because in some ways the association of women with a spiritual or cultural realm as opposed to the public has become part of common sense theorizing about anti-colonial nationalist movements. And I think that part of this analysis is going to have to address the different ways that transnational discourses about gender in Islam are being engaged and circulated and appropriated or reformulated today. And it's also going to have to address the question of how those engagements themselves are incorporated into what's understood as religious duty or social duty, and the relationship between moral personhood and community. So, I guess by way of concluding, I view the transnational lens as a tool for thinking about the complex relationships between religion, and specifically Islam in this case, and politics for a number of reasons. In part because these circulations of knowledge and engagements with knowledge may challenge us to think through concepts of religion and politics differently, and also because of the ways the civilizational dichotomies that are drawn through those very discourses have been called upon in support of various political, economic, and military and social projects. I think it's also a lens that complicates our understandings of the ways that various models of moral womanhood that incorporate both piety and politics as inseparable aspects of life are constructed and contested. And then finally, for me right now, it's raising questions about the contrasts between the relationships of gender norms to anti-colonial nationalisms versus anti-neo-imperialist movements today.
So what would be the difference here in the communities or sites you have observed between men and women on this question of piety and creation of a new idea of humankind or mankind?
There has been an increased sense of this sort of joint decision of being modern through both pious practice and pious practice defining modernity in a sense for men as well, except men are not, it's women in households who call upon men to enact it, for example. And when men also, there is, the problem is part of this goes back to the Ashura story in Shi'ism and the way that has been, which I fully left out of this today, and the way that has been used to, not necessarily to mobilize, but the way that narrative comes into this dynamic. And in that narrative, the role of Zainab, who is the model that women look to, begins after the battle. So part of this has to do with the way that her role is the one that goes into the future, where Hussein's role ends at the battle. So this is also a context where you've had a military resistance to an Israeli occupation for 22 years that only ended in 2000, and that sense of military resistance is ongoing. So men's enactment has been very much channeled into the military realm and has had less to do with particular practices of piety, and has had much less to do with ideas about development and modernization as well. And I don't know how, I don't know what happens when you remove that military context, because that situation has never yet happened in Lebanon. I suspect that this entire dynamic will shift. But that's been a limiting factor in the way that men are able to be brought into the narrative themselves.
Just what you said reminds me actually that possibly one way of dealing with that would be to look if there are gender differentials in the pietist movement by comparing Lebanon and Hezbollah with a context in which the pietist movement is not as politicized like Egypt,
Yeah.
of course, and see what those differences are.
Yeah. Where, and again, that part of the what takes place here is that people tend to study only the women's side or only the men's side, and there's been much more written about women's participation in pietistic movements in places like Egypt, for example, where the question still remains as to what forms does men's participation take, which is a big question. Yeah. I think. Are you doing this or am I doing this? I'm doing it? Okay.
I was just wondering, in the work you did in South Beirut, did you come across did you form any impression of what was happening in the Palestinian camps in terms of the role of women, the role of women's NGOs, and whether they tended towards being secular NGOs, harking back to pseudo-communism, or whether they were becoming more Islamic, what women's roles were?
But the Palestinian camps all over Lebanon are sort of spaces unto themselves where there has been a shift towards more religious organizing and activism in NGOs. Political parties are technically banned in Lebanon, so they're all NGOs. But that shift has had as much to do with the failures of politics on the left, with disaffection with certain political parties within the Palestinian territory. So it's about these kinds of transnational dynamics that we see also within the camps in Lebanon. But it's much more about the internal dynamics among political groups than it is related to this, the outside community.
Perhaps we
Well,
should
yeah,
when
maybe
we
I'll
come
sit
back and we
and
can open it up for general discussion.
Laura, I think this is a fascinating presentation, as was yours. By connecting transnational feminism with your referencing to post-colonial theory and remembering something from a long time ago by Gayatri Chakraborty's where she has that article, Can the Subaltern Speak? It seems to me, in imperialist terms, we're saying, can the pious pray? And what I see coming together in your presentations, and I think is so wonderful, is this individual moment in time where we allow a human being, a woman, to find some kind of spiritual sustenance in a tradition that might be problematized by everybody else. But this is her world, this is her life. And we're so busy politically trying to belittle that. And that's what I find so disturbing. And I like very much the clarity of taking the Lebanese situation and going back to India and seeing those parallels. So I can't imagine the study that you're going to end up with.
two things.
Thank you so much.
But I think it's also, you didn't have a question in there, but can I respond anyway? I think I think it's also, I mean, it's also a sense, and I think for me it goes back to this category of what is religious discourse or what is religious practice, where there isn't a sense of separation between an act of prayer and an act of confronting a stereotype. They're both viewed as a sort of a duty in different ways, but not only duties to oneself, but duties to God in different ways. So there is this kind of linking and a blurring of the category that I'm trying to grapple with in different ways as well.
I respond to that too because that's a rich comment, and it does. I think that is a link maybe between these and other things we've heard today too. That and you use the term belittle, and I agree. I think that there's not so many people working in this field and in religious studies more broadly and in other fields as well who say we no longer want to belittle things. How can we understand them better? And the difficulty becomes, not to romanticize and not to maintain these different perspectives. And to me, that's always the challenge, and a fascinating challenge, but a tricky challenge to try and say, okay, on the one hand, we want to understand at the level of what the women or whomever see themselves as doing, so we speak to them. We do ethnographic research, or we do thick archival historical research, and we try to understand from that perspective. But you don't end there, right? So this is where the theory comes into our work, and this is what I take it, and your interest in this event sort of is. So how do we do that without making the theory reduce those narratives to these models that are out there? And it's a dance. I mean, it's a really complicated thing, and I think this is where the really hard analytic work comes in. But anyway, just to say, but I appreciate your comment. I think it's a complicated endeavor.
Marie, on that point, will you talk about how you do that with even performance theory, that certainly resistance and accommodation are not sufficient models or agency for talking about religious practice, because you end up doing a lot of what Carol was talking about. But even in the conversation about performance, Judith Butler uses the term to talk about what's not real, right? Mm-hmm. So that in talking about religion and performance, how do you get around the slippery slope of talking about something as performance, when she's really talking about what's not real?
Oh, that's a great question. This is Marla Frederick. Many of you know her and others don't. Marla has an essay in my Women in Religion in the African Diaspora collection, which I should have mentioned, a wonderful essay and a wonderful book that pertains also to our discussions here. I think, what's interesting is I first read sort of performance studies in graduate school, long before I ever heard of Judith Butler, and in fact, probably in that 2001 class that Bill Graham taught when I was a first-year doctoral student here. I mean, there were ways in which there was this longer trajectory of dealing with that question of performance studies, theater studies. Probably then I had some of that background to read Judith Butler in a way. But what I think you're getting at, I don't think I have a pat answer for you. I've been very helped by, many of you may know, the Joan Scott essay on experience. And I find that a very helpful way to think about, okay, experience has been overused in feminist readings of many things, including religion. But does that mean we throw it out the window? Like, do we throw resistance out the window? Or where does authenticity lie, and how do you balance some of these things? So I guess, again, my response is to try and take what people say is really real to them. This is what you did in Between Sundays, right? You take what's really real to them, and then you analyze it. But you analyze it in a way that they still recognize themselves. I actually remember someone who is now deceased, unfortunately, Virginia Brereton. Some of you may know her work or have known her when she was alive. But I remember her saying once to me, you want the women to recognize themselves in what you write. They don't have to agree with your perspective. And you try to make that clear, and I think that's true whether we're ethnographers or historians or political scientists or whatever, to try and get that. So I think, again, it's taking those levels and trying to see that. Yes, it's performance, but isn't so much of what we do performance. To call it performance is not to reduce it in maybe the kind of most reductive modes of performance theory. Is that clear?
You know, one of the things that I think I heard in both your presentations, and even earlier today, in particular in Janet's, is a sense of the inadequacy of the terms we've inherited, that they're no longer, whether it's post-colonialism or theory or the study of religion, that we are at a moment in which, whether the history we're living or something else is showing that we have to come up with some new ways of thinking and speaking. Would you
Absolutely, yeah.
But I don't think, absolutely. But I also think that's sort of the nature of how scholarship works, right? Where there's always a certain set of inherited terms, and then we work with those terms, reshape them, figure out, and the question becomes, in what ways, what can we take from this? And then when we take something from it, does it change? How does it change either the meaning of the term, or are we actually trying to figure out a new language with which to speak of things?
That's right. And I think as we age, don't we appreciate some of the older models more? I mean, speaking for myself, say, boy, I thought I knew it all as a grad student. And then you say, wow, I didn't know anything. And, that gradually you see what was in those older models, that it takes you a while to interpret correctly. So that would be the other side of it, too.
I see two questions. One.
I read a very fascinating book on bodily bodies. It was sexuality and bodily modification. And I noticed that you noted that many of your programs directed at men were fasting programs, whereas those directed at women were dieting programs. And I was wondering what was your take on why that might be. And I have a second question. It seems to me that, like, in the Christian tradition, there is very much this. The ingestion is in the Eucharist, and I was wondering if there's any connection at all with these attempts to modify the body through
Well, just to respond to your first question, I think the fasting models, first of all, there's a temporal difference. So the period I was really writing about, the fasting programs, was late 19th into the 20th century, the progressive era. And I think this was a time that other historians have well established masculinity was in crisis in American circles. I mean, people were really worried about what masculinity was. Has civilization emasculated us? So I think part of the fasting being directed at men, fasting at that period was really seen as a practice of strength and power and proof that you were virile in all these kinds of fascinating ways. Those concerns maybe retreated as other concerns rose to the fore, and the diet programs that I'm writing about are really a more recent phenomenon. People have asked me before, why did it go from men to women? And I'm not sure that's true. I think the trajectory of the book may imply that in a way that I don't mean to, because I think increasingly, I guess, I've learned or thought more about the ways that men are gendered too, through their own fitness practice, their own bodily anxieties in our own time as well. But the notion of having a shapely body in order to please God, is tied up in notions of ideal femininity and those kinds of things. So I would only resist. I didn't mean to suggest that only men fast and only women diet, but there is something about that manliness, the need for a manly practice of fasting, the extreme fasting, 40-day fast in that earlier period, that I think makes sense in that context. I've forgotten your second question. I'm sorry. Oh, the Eucharist. Yeah.
There's so much about purging.
Yeah.
And also with bodily life, with flesh.
That's right. Yeah. So very different models of eating as a devotional act, right? I mentioned Caroline Walker Bynum, who, if there's any greater inspiration on my whole career, I don't know. I mean, she's been someone whose work I've been so fascinated by, and she really writes so beautifully about that dichotomy. Not dichotomy. I mean, or just about that. the both and in the Middle Ages. It's a book I highly recommend, The Holy Feast and Holy Fast, about feasting as a religious act in the Middle Ages for women, but also the fasting, really seeing both sides of this very complicated, wrenching almost sort of practices around food. And it seems to me the same, not the same remains true in a flat way, but I mean that we have our own kinds of double-edged ways of dealing with food today, certainly.
I have been working with the United Nations, and when I was a student in Harvard, they have been doing a lot of women's issues and so on, and rallying, and they're doing all kinds of things during the 74, 76, and so on. But I do have a great respect for American women because they really changed the origin, because in terms of women's issue, and really, I mean, it's a very fascinating history, part of American women's history for me, because I've been teaching 11th grade, 12th, and so on, American history. One of the international schools in the United Nations. So when I think back of how they really come to this point, these American women, very precious people. I'm so, sometimes I just overwhelmed with happiness and joy. And we have a new day now. Thank God everything is going well. And, great hope.
Yes.
That's what I got.
Thank you. That's a lovely point. Sometimes we forget the love and the honor that we pay to these women. And can I just say 3 words that haven't been uttered yet in my presence today, which are Drew, Gilpin, Faust, and in this particular moment. I mean, so there are things to celebrate, certainly. But I think it's also true that American women, the more they've turned to the transnational, to other contexts, the more women here have also learned from others. And their, moments of our history are also filled with arrogance that we know how to do it best. And so I appreciate your comments, and I also think that American women do best to learn from others in turn, right?
One more question? Yes?
Oh, yeah, hi. Maria, I felt a sense of relief in your description of your 2 different projects and your willingness to say that you didn't have to have the same sort of approach to both projects. That you said, the first project I really decided that agency was going to be my focus, and the second project I didn't have to have that same set of theoretical questions at play. I had a different set of questions about cultural discipline at work, and so I appreciate that was kind of a relief in a way to hear that you don't have to simultaneously do everything at once on one set of circumstances. That you think about which one makes more sense and which one applies more integrated. But I'm curious to hear you talk about how you make that decision. If you would push on a certain circumstance that you thought maybe the cultural discipline was the real interpretive category, if you push in that circumstance, you might, I'm sure you would, find pockets of resistance or find pockets of agency. How do you decide, I'm going to stick with this other one, or you know what I'm getting at? I'm kind of curious how you make that break.
Okay, so maybe a little more candor. The second project really emerged from the first project, and some of you may know this, that there's a section in God's Daughters on Christian diet programs, which was something I discovered when I was doing this research. And there's a chapter in God's Daughters on discipline and authority. And partly I think I didn't think that through as deeply as I should have, maybe, because I was so intent on doing something more nuanced with conservative religious women's lives. And that was really the point of that book, trying to open that up. But, maybe it's a pendulum thing. I don't know what metaphor to use, but, you say, okay, well, I did that, but, wow, there's a lot of other stuff here, and I saw other things about these women's lives, and especially thinking more about that diet stuff and diet culture. And so, maybe sometimes you have an analysis that works somewhere, but it's weighted or it's tilted, and so that would be one way to explain it. That's tilted in that direction. Now, what happens if I really think hard about questions others have pressed me on, and some book reviews pressed me on? Well, what about the other side, And I didn't try to make it all sunshine and light, as someone said earlier, but, it's a sunnier book. What if you turn that around and look at other things? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think it was sort of an attempt to really think in two ways about overlapping cultures. They're not the same culture there, but overlapping ones.
Yes, I'd like to ask Laura about your work in South Beirut. The degree to which, in trying to track things involved with piety and women, you found, and of course in a Shiite context, the degree to which you found that other factors like, let's say, the broader Lebanese culture and norms, to the degree that they may have penetrated here, or let's say the issues of class, which in South Beirut strikes me as a major. I mean, Beirut is such a place where extremes of class meet in various ways. And I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about, if you found this to be problematic, or if these problems somehow affected how you were dealing with the things you talked about.
Class was absolutely an aspect of it, because part of this entire notion of progress and the sort of linking of the material and the spiritual had a lot to do with this idea of bringing up the community in terms of status, and which has to do with sort of a long history of the Shia community in Lebanon in particular being marginalized within the state and being marginalized economically in the country, and then the southern suburbs of Beirut having taken on over time this sort of, it was sort of the stereotyped area of the city that other people from other parts of Beirut feared to go. And had a lot of stereotypical connotations about poverty and that linked poverty and religion and ignorance in certain ways. So part of this was about bringing certain ideas about religious practice that were linked to ideas about education, together with ideas about development, where you almost had a sort of missionizing within the community. So you would have members of the community who worked in volunteer organizations who were of a higher socioeconomic status who would actively work to teach these kinds of ideals of progress.
So they were Shiite as
Yes,
well?
absolutely. No, within the Shia Muslim community. And so that was kind of part and parcel of the entire notion of progress to begin with, and that brought the material with the spiritual. In terms of the rest of Lebanon, that's actually become more of an issue today. At the time that I did my fieldwork, there was a sort of ethos of coexistence, and the Civil War had been, it had been over for, when I was there, 6, 7, 8 years. And there was this period where the Lebanese resistance that Hezbollah had taken the lead in was looked upon very favorably by most Lebanese. So the idea of other communities being part of this sort of other was not as present as it is today. But since this past summer, that has completely changed. And right now you have a situation where there's been a bifurcation in society where once again, actually, you're seeing a lot of rhetoric in newspapers and in the way people talk about the Shia protesters, for example, in downtown Beirut, that is reassociating certain stereotypes about class and religiosity in ways that you hadn't seen in 10 or 15 years because of the current political sort of standoff. So.
Let me just pursue just a little further one thing. I'm curious to know, would most of the Shiite women have been Shiites from, or Shiite families from primarily the south, from Saida and Tur and the mountains in the south? And would that be, did that play a factor that a lot of these were presumably, my guess is a lot of them were either immigrants from the south or refugees from the south?
Many, but the south, the Baqa, but also other parts of Beirut. Because during the Lebanese Civil War, you had, every time Israel invaded the country, you had a huge influx of displaced people from the south that came up to the southern suburbs, but also from the Baqa Valley. But you also had a reconfiguration of space within the city. So people who lived in northern parts of Beirut, for example, who were Shia, had moved to the southern suburbs during the Civil War, because all of these neighborhoods sort of took on different kinds of sectarian uniformity. So many of them were, but not entirely. But the other thing is, all of Lebanon, the south is a half an hour drive. So the meanings of these distances are very different than the meanings of these distances are in the U.S., for example.
I'm just wondering to what degree some of these factors figure in as much as just, let's say, straight religious or
Yeah.
Shiite things. That's really what I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, there's also a sense that leaving behind, traditional religious practice, which was something that was left behind, right, was supposed to be left behind, was associated with the rural areas, right? So that was also, an aspect of it.
Yes, well, one and two. Go ahead.
Lara, the question to you. I mean, you talked about women serving the public piety as part of the religious duty, and also, just performing the religious duty as well, also the ritualistic part of it. Also, there's a huge emphasis on being domesticated and being a good mother and a good wife. I mean, how did they feel about all this split and having this much demand on their time and energy?
I mean, it was exhausting much of the time, but a stunning amount of the conversations were about things like insisting that various employers in the southern suburbs provide free daycare, for example. So it was all about accommodating the public role with the domestic role. They ran a lot of seminars for men in the party to literally teach men how to take care of small children, for example, and to teach men about how to, so this kind of negotiation and sort of compromise without leaving. I mean, they never left. I mean, that's a good point. The domestic ideology remained, right? But mostly in terms of childcare, and less so in terms of domestic duty. So one of the things they would say, for example, is that it is not in no way a wife's responsibility to take care of the household. That is something that is negotiated, and in the marriage contract, actually many younger women today have begun to write into their marriage contracts notes about how they don't have to do housework, they will keep their employment. I mean, like literally in this level of detail, and they set out, they actually negotiate this into the marriage contract, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do among in this particular community, and it's constantly negotiated in these forms.
So was this brought out because of their public piety?
In part, it was because of this idea that participating in the public sphere was a way of it was a duty to society. It's very much about your responsibility to the community, right? And for a woman to fulfill her responsibility to the community, for her partner or husband or her family to facilitate that, they're sort of doing good deeds too. So you have this kind of, spilling out of the good deeds that one is doing into those who facilitate that. So that kind of logic was also used in that sense.
A question which comes out of paraphrasing one of the statements you made, Lara, and it's directed both to yourself and to Marie. I see there's a point of comparison between both of your papers. You said something like women's status, visibility, bodies of women mark boundaries between us and them. And I'm wondering, who's the us and the them, and the ways in which they sometimes might get blurred. And I've heard some of that in some of your responses. And Marie, I also kind of hear that as being very relevant for all of the projects that you've presented. So maybe you've reflected on one or all of them.
I was in this thing that us and them have big quotation marks around them, but they don't come out when I speak. But I was referring to the ways that the idea of the Muslim woman gets, for example, constructed in the United States and in U.S. rhetoric, and at the same time the way that an idea of the Western woman gets constructed in the rhetoric in these seminars, for example, or for that matter, the way an idea of, say, a particularly classed Lebanese woman who is Druze, for example, from a different religious community, might get set up as a particular type of woman. So it was just the idea that that gender is one of the primary ways in which you get this kind of us-them dichotomy that gets set up frequently, and in these kinds of exaggerated, stereotyped ways.
Mm-hmm. I think this is most relevant for me with Born Again Bodies, which is where the us-them distinctions, and that book is really structured around a series of case studies in which embodiment and dietary disciplines became really important to particular groups of people over time. It's not a synthetic history of all bodily disciplines in American Christianity or American religion or American history, But where I think I saw it the most prominent, and most of the research is from the late 19th century into the present. I mean, you can really see this in the late 19th, early 20th century anxieties around immigration. And, the fasters I mentioned earlier in response to the earlier question were, white middle-class men. I mean, along with this fixation on masculinity, it's a fixation on the immigrant and how do we, not look like that. And, it's racialized in other ways, obviously, as well. The place where it became, but others have written about some of that. I mean, in that period, it's pretty obvious. I think where I got more consumed by this and interested in this is the figure of the fat female body in more contemporary context. And in some of these predominantly white evangelical contexts, what is that body? And oftentimes it's a racialized body. It's an African American body. It's a poor body. So class and race became really critical. And once I I don't know why it took me so long. It shouldn't have. But, in my analysis, once I recognized this, it was so apparent everywhere. And I could go back to the 50s and earlier Christian diet books and really see where race and class had been present throughout, in this more modern, contemporary dietary mode. So I became very interested. It was tied up. There were mission women who would write about, I've got a quote in the book about that poor pudding bag shaped woman, sort of I forget if it was Africa, some country over there. And so but we can do so much for her. It became a rhetoric of missionizing and of helping the poor and of helping that dark, fat person. So that racialized discourse, it became a very clear us and them thing. And, looking at the obesity, what they call the obesity epidemic today, and who gets targeted and who doesn't, I think that's quite apparent now, too. So it gave me a new lens to think about that, and think even about broader health issues and medical care and those kinds of things. But, yes, thank you.
Thank you both very much. I really enjoyed your presentations. I liked the presentation. I was intrigued, of course, with the connections you try to make between what the locals perceive as the public piety and for them connecting it to transnational discourse and what have you. I'm just wondering, in the face of what happened in the aftermath of the Israeli-Hezbollah war, and then in relation to Hezbollah to Iran, how do these women, given the critique they might have had of the Iranian model after the revolution, how do they view what's happening in Iran right now, given what Afsan was talking about, and how much what's going on between them, and how do they connect to that kind of locally and transnationally?
Part of the problem.
Speaking to the mic.
Oh, sorry. Part of the problem in this aftermath, and in the way that there's a current standoff in Lebanon, for those who aren't as familiar with this, where there's an incumbent government that is sort of backed by the United States very publicly and is doing sort of things like putting forth proposals for neoliberal economic reforms. So it's also tied to sort of ideas about capitalism. And then Hezbollah is a major party in an opposition movement, right? Which also, and the Christians in the country are actually split in half between these two camps. So you have a bifurcation of the country. And then the government is accusing Hezbollah of being a pawn of Iran and Syria. So this is the kind of dynamic. So what the problem is the way that has polarized society. Critique has been, people, I'm on MSN chat, this is the way I communicate with people in Lebanon all the time, and some of my closest friends will still sort of say more sort of nuanced, complex things, but most people have fully taken on this polarization. And that's been actually one of the few people in Lebanon. There's a sort of small community in Lebanon that sometimes talk about themselves as secularists or as leftists, which is sort of a complex thing in that context, who have tried to who will be sort of writing from a more complex or a less polarized position, but that number is shrinking, and even sort of in the press, among academics, among people in the universities, people are really actually taking on these polarizations in ways that I've actually never seen in the country before. So the effect of this has been to silence a lot of the debate. And even within the party, there was much more debate in the years between 2000 and 2006 because you had this space where there was a sort of peace. right, where kinds of debates about all sorts of things were possible, and now that again has been it's been really suppressed.
Particularly, like this fear of creating the fear of Shi'i crescent.
Yes.
And how that is going to be.
Yeah, and the thing is, the Shi'i crescent phrase is one of my pet peeves right now, for so many reasons. But the problem is that in Lebanon, for example, this is a political problem, and it's a political economic problem that gets talked about in this as though it's some kind of essentialized Shi'i Sunni problem within Islam. And the example I keep giving is saying it's like explaining the conflict in Northern Ireland as a conflict over transubstantiation. I mean, it's that kind of example, where it's not a conflict about, the battle at Karbala. It's a conflict about real political economic realities today, and then it gets placed onto this Shi'i-Sunni division. And then on both sides in Lebanon, leaders and people in the community will take up some of that rhetoric, so then it actually becomes to resemble a religious conflict when in fact the underlying causes were not there. Sorry.
Thank you both for very stimulating talks. Lara, you face some of the problems I also faced in my research, and they wonder when reflecting on feminisms and women in Muslim majority countries, don't you see that one of the problems is that we focus on urban areas? And my question to you is, well, you have managed successfully to link what's happening now in southern Beirut to transnational discourse, but the way you presented it, this is how I felt, sort of dislocated it from what must have happened in rural areas. And the tradition goes like, let me put it in a crude way, you give the impression that everything started there, and there must have been a link with a continuous link with traditional religious practices. And I'm sure that these traditional rural practices are also, if you want, subject to some kind of regeneration. I don't know how to put this, but they disappear sometimes. We don't see them in the writings, but suddenly they reappear under different guises. I wonder whether you reflected on any links between what you said and what is largely not recorded, must be oral. Have you reflected on this aspect?
A little bit. Does this work? So part of what I didn't talk about at all today, but that I do in other venues, is that this idea, the way that spiritual progress is enacted is by separating oneself from what the people I would talk to in Lebanon would call traditional, right? So a lot of the people not only in the urban setting, in some rural settings as well, would look at, say, the practices, or earlier generational practices, especially around things like Ashura, and they would label them traditional, and there was a big reform movement around particular practices. And what's happened in Lebanon is that, partially because the country is so small, people are constantly going back and forth. So very few people just live in the urban setting, but you go back to the village on weekends, you go back to the village for weddings, you go back to the village to vote. I mean, there's a continuous kind of because your village is an hour or two away at most. I mean, the entire country you can drive from top to bottom in 4 hours. It's very, very small. So there is this kind of, the idea of a rural-urban divide is much blurrier than it is in some other places just because of this proximity. But part of what's happened is that Nabateeh, for example, a town in the south, has become a location where what people in Beirut think of as traditional practice and practice that is to be left behind and changed continues to happen very publicly in Nabateeh, almost as a response to this reform movement. And you get these kinds of bifurcations where it's, again, also within the community has become more and more polarized because of this sort of active reform element. Well, that was a great question. Thanks.
I had a question for Marie. I really enjoyed your talk. And I wondered about the question of access to birth control and abortion rights in America, which is
Oh, what a wonderful question. So this pertains more to the sexuality stuff I'm doing now, so I'll file that away because that's a great question. It is true that I guess let me turn your question into a meta question, because I think the point is, yes, that different kinds of contexts, again, make you think differently about this. If I'm going to write about Catholic women and debates over abortion or contraception, or particularly the debate that's so live even today over the counter, the pill. Right. Emergency contraception. Thank you. Yeah. That's a whole different range of things. And then you have to say, and this is why I think this was a throwaway line in my talk, what is choice? And this is another thing that comes out in the classroom in interesting ways when we try to talk about power, because a lot of these students, this goes back to the students, to the question someone asked me earlier about, isn't this contextual in the classroom? Students want to think about choice. Well, choice is exactly what your question is asking. And if suddenly the choices are narrowed or limited, how do you open that up? So absolutely, I think in terms of those questions you're raising, and probably this is one thing that's led me into sexuality, not only because this is a debate that is just so live in our time, and that the religious groups, their views have actually changed. I mean, some of them have become very mobilized around sexuality issues, if we include abortion and contraception in that category, which we must. So yes, absolutely, the models have to shift there too, which is why I'm not ready to talk about gender theory in this new project. Thank you, though. It's a great question.
We can have one final question.
Marie, this question is for you. I'm heavily influenced by your book, God's Daughters, and coming from an evangelical tradition and appreciating the nuance and the character of which you treat some of the issues. And I'm thinking about I teach feminist theology, which obviously requires a certain leaving of home academically, intellectually, and thinking about, you talk about feminist theory as playing a role in your work, and I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the relationship between evangelicalism and feminist theology. I've had tensions in the classroom. It's interesting. My last year was of extreme hostility towards my evangelical students who actually dared to enter feminist theology classroom, and very volatile but fruitful conversations about evangelical theology and feminism. And I have a sense that feminist theology has failed to address some of the issues, the complexity of evangelicalism, and I'm wondering if you could offer some insight.
Well, Princeton is full of evangelical undergraduates, so this comes up a lot. I think in different ways. Maybe I'm not teaching feminist theology, although I teach, certain books like I teach Mary Daly and certain things as part of larger classes, and those issues certainly come up. I found Mary McClintock Fulkerson's book very helpful. I mean, I think there are good models out there that can speak to evangelical students, at least the ones who enter that classroom. The ones who don't, what can you do? But the ones that do, I think that the conversations can be very fruitful. But I completely agree with you, and I think this was again one of the motivations behind God's Daughters was how can we translate? If the word feminist is a dirty word in some evangelical settings, as it still is today. But actually, if you could get past the word and talk about the ideas and the concepts, and you find this great openness, and you find that students and grown women are, really want to talk about this stuff and relationships with men and sexism and that kind of thing, then I think it's very possible. I haven't stayed up on feminist theology. You may have readings for me that you could suggest. I really don't know, but it certainly seems to me that model of feminist theology has certain connotations that many evangelical women just aren't willing to even enter that in itself feels like something that's really rebellious in a way that they're not willing to go. Is that your sense too?
Hostility was actually the other way. That
evangelical
students were actually extremely receptive.
I see.
I mean, they wouldn't have taken the class unless they really
Sure.
wanted to. But the kind of the reception by some of the more radical. I mean, I had
Yeah.
Those who wanted to leave, not want to talk about God in the feminist theology classroom, and those who, a woman who is preparing to go back into an evangelical study to teach.
Yeah.
And actually the hostility was more on the other end.
Right. I see. Yeah. I mean, I know of Nancy Duff, who's really an ethicist at Princeton Theological Seminary, but teaches courses on feminist theology. And I think she has probably really dealt with this directly because they get a lot of evangelical students there, too. They get a real mix, just as Drew Theological School or other theological schools. I'm sure Harvard Divinity School does, too. But there's more of a range at some of these other more traditional schools where these things have to be addressed. So I've certainly never seen sympathetic feminist theology that looked sympathetic to those questions, but they're so antithetical, or they can appear antithetical. But I'm sure there are more complex models out there. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
I think let's thank the panelists for wonderfully.
And just let me say a word of thanks to all the presenters and to all the participants for this rich discussion. I really feel enriched that we've shared so many resources for how to do our own work, and maybe that's an oversimplification, but just an enormous amount of stimulation for new questions to ask. I'm very grateful to all of you, and join us again in the Braun Room.